On May 26, 1828, an unusual boy appeared in the streets of Nuremberg, Germany, seemingly out of nowhere. He looked to be about 16 years old, yet he walked unsteadily, as if he had never properly learned to do so. His clothes were old, torn, and barely fit him, and his skin was pale, suggesting that he had spent most of his life away from sunlight. The boy clutched a letter in his hands, addressed to Captain von Wessenig, a local military officer. He could barely speak and seemed confused and overwhelmed by his surroundings. When taken to the authorities, he repeated only a few words, mostly the phrase, "I want to be a cavalryman like my father." Beyond that, he seemed unable to communicate clearly. The letter he carried only deepened the mystery. It was unsigned and written in strange, childlike handwriting, suggesting that it had been composed by someone with little formal education. The note explained that the boy's name was Kaspar Hauser and that he had been raised in total isolation. The letter claimed that Kaspar had never left his caretaker's house and that he had been taught only basic words and phrases. It also stated that if he ever tried to leave, he would not be allowed to return. As the people of Nuremberg examined Kaspar, they realized that he was unlike any other teenager. He struggled to walk properly, as if he had never been allowed to move freely. When presented with ordinary food, he recoiled at the taste, only willing to eat bread and water. His hands were soft and unmarked, showing no signs of ever having done manual labor. His eyes were extremely sensitive to light, and he was startled by loud sounds, suggesting that he had been kept in a silent, dark place for most of his life. As days passed, people began to wonder, where had he come from? Was he truly an orphan raised in isolation? Or was he someone far more important, someone whose identity had been deliberately hidden? As Kaspar began to speak more, his story became even stranger, leading to one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of all time. As Kaspar Hauser slowly adjusted to life in Nuremberg, it became clear that he was not like any other teenager. His behaviors, preferences, and reactions to the world around him were so unusual that many began to wonder if he was even human in the traditional sense. He had no understanding of everyday objects and reacted to his surroundings as if everything was new to him. He did not recognize his own reflection in a mirror, seemed puzzled by household tools, and struggled to understand even the simplest social interactions. But what was even stranger were the highly specific abilities and sensitivities he possessed, traits that seemed impossible for a boy raised in isolation. One of the first things people noticed about Kaspar was his extreme sensitivity to light and noise. Even the gentle glow of a candle caused him visible discomfort, and he squinted painfully when exposed to daylight, as if he had spent years in darkness. Similarly, loud noises overwhelmed him to the point of panic. The ringing of church bells, the barking of dogs, and even the sound of footsteps on stone startled him in ways that seemed unnatural. Had he been kept in complete silence for most of his life? And if so, why? Kaspar had an extremely peculiar diet. In the first few weeks after his discovery, he refused to eat anything except bread and water. Even the smell of meat or vegetables made him recoil, as though he had never encountered them before. Some believed this was a sign that he had been malnourished or deprived of proper food for most of his life. Others theorized that he had been conditioned to eat only what his captors allowed. Strangely, despite his limited diet, he seemed to possess incredible endurance. He could go for long periods without eating, yet showed no signs of physical weakness. Although Kaspar struggled with basic human interactions, he displayed uncanny intelligence in certain areas. Without any formal education, he was able to quickly learn to read and write at an astonishing speed. Some believed he had latent knowledge that had simply been suppressed. Others thought that he had been secretly trained in specific skills, only to have his memory wiped or altered in some way. One of the most unsettling things about Kaspar was his ability to sense people's emotions without them speaking. He seemed to have an almost psychic awareness of others' intentions, reacting with visible distress in the presence of certain individuals, even when they had done nothing to provoke him. As Kaspar became more integrated into society, he started recalling fragments of his past. He described being locked in a small, dark room for years, given only bread and water, and never being allowed to see another human face. But just as he began remembering details that could reveal the truth about his origins, something terrifying happened. Someone tried to kill him. One evening, as Kaspar was staying in the home of a local professor, an unknown assailant broke into his room and struck him in the head with a heavy object. Kaspar survived the attack, but he could not identify who had tried to kill him. This attack was only the beginning of a dark and sinister chain of events, ones that would ultimately lead to his mysterious murder. As Kaspar's presence in Nuremberg gained attention, speculation about his origins intensified. His unusual behaviors, sensitivity to light and sound, and apparent lack of social conditioning led many to believe that he was not just an ordinary orphan. Theories ranged from the possibility that he was a lost prince, hidden away to prevent him from claiming his birthright, to the disturbing idea that he had been the subject of a secret experiment in human isolation. Others dismissed his story altogether, believing that he was nothing more than a skilled fraudster who had fooled an entire city. One of the most widely believed theories suggested that Kaspar Hauser was the rightful heir to the throne of Baden, a German duchy. Supporters of this theory claimed that he was the missing son of Charles, Grand Duke of Baden, and Stephanie de Beauharnais, a noblewoman closely tied to Napoleon. According to this theory, Kaspar's birth would have disrupted the political landscape, as his survival would have ensured that a rival faction of the Baden family lost their claim to the throne. It was rumored that soon after his birth, the real prince was secretly kidnapped and replaced with a dying infant, allowing another branch of the family to solidify their power. If this were true, it would explain why Kaspar had been raised in complete isolation. His captors had allegedly kept him alive but had denied him any contact with the outside world, ensuring that he would never come forward to challenge the ruling family. When he suddenly appeared in Nuremberg, some believed that he had either escaped from his captors or had been released intentionally. His lack of basic knowledge about the world and his peculiar habits were seen as evidence of his years spent in captivity. However, there was no definitive proof to support this theory. No royal records confirmed his birth, and the Grand Duke of Baden's family publicly denied any connection to him. While some experts have speculated that DNA testing could provide a conclusive answer, no such test has ever definitively proven that Kaspar was of royal descent. Another disturbing theory suggested that Kaspar had not been hidden for political reasons but had been the subject of a cruel psychological experiment. Some researchers proposed that he had been deliberately raised in isolation as part of a study on human development, possibly to observe how a child would behave when deprived of social interaction. His inability to recognize common objects, his extreme dietary restrictions, and his hypersensitivity to stimuli all pointed to the possibility that he had been conditioned to live under highly controlled circumstances. If this were true, the most pressing question remained: who was behind this experiment and for what purpose? If Kaspar had been part of a secret study, it would explain why someone had tried to kill him. His captors may have released him into society as a test, only to realize that he was remembering too much. The attempts on his life could have been efforts to silence him before he could reveal the truth about where he had come from. If this theory were true, then whoever was responsible for his captivity had resources and influence enough to ensure that Kaspar would never expose them. Despite the theories that painted him as a victim, there were those who believed that Kaspar Hauser was nothing more than an imposter. Some skeptics suggested that he had invented his backstory, using his strange behaviors to gain attention and sympathy. As he learned to communicate, some of his recollections became more elaborate, sometimes contradicting earlier statements. His apparent intelligence and rapid ability to learn new skills raised suspicions that he may have been exaggerating his earlier ignorance. There were also accounts of Kaspar seeking out the company of wealthy patrons who were fascinated by his story. If he had truly been locked away in a dark room for years, how had he managed to integrate into society so quickly? Was his entire story a fabrication, carefully designed to manipulate those around him? If so, why had he chosen to appear in Nuremberg, and what had been his ultimate goal? Even if Kaspar had been lying about his past, one undeniable fact remained: someone wanted him dead. He had survived previous attempts on his life, but his final moments would prove that he was not safe. If he was an imposter, Why would anyone go to such lengths to kill him? If his story had been nothing more than an elaborate lie, what was the motive behind his murder? Kaspar Hauser had spent years searching for answers about his past, but in 1833, those answers would die with him. His murder, like his life, remains an unsolved mystery, one that continues to fuel speculation nearly 2 centuries later. After spending nearly 5 years in Nuremberg, Kaspar Hauser had become both a figure of fascination and a source of controversy. His story had captured the imagination of intellectuals, scientists, and nobility, but he had also gained enemies, some of whom wanted him silenced forever. On December 14, 1833, Kaspar staggered back to his residence, clutching his side, his hands drenched in blood. His eyes were filled with terror as he gasped that he had been stabbed by a stranger in the park. His caretaker and guardian, Johann Meyer, rushed to his side, trying to understand what had happened. Kaspar struggled to speak, his voice weak as he claimed that a man had lured him to the Ansbach court garden under false pretenses, and then suddenly attacked him. When authorities searched the scene of the crime, they discovered a small purse containing a cryptic note. The message, written in an unfamiliar script, read, "Hauser will be able to tell you who I am. To save him the effort, I will tell you myself. I come from the Bavarian border. I will even tell you my name, MLO." The note, which seemed deliberately misleading, raised more questions than it answered. If the attacker had intended to kill Kaspar, why had they left a note at all? Was it a taunt, a final warning, or an attempt to mislead investigators? Kaspar's condition worsened over the next few days. Despite being treated for his wounds, his health rapidly declined. On December 17, 1833, he took his last breath. His final words were a whisper, barely audible. "I have no enemy. I do not know this man." He was just 21 years old. Kaspar's murder only deepened the mystery surrounding his life. If his story was a lie, why would someone go to such lengths to kill him? If he truly had been an heir to a noble family, or the subject of a secret experiment, had his killers finally succeeded in ensuring that the truth would never come to light? Authorities investigated the attack, but the more they searched for answers, the stranger the case became. The note found at the scene provided no useful leads, and no witnesses had seen a man fleeing the garden after the attack. Some began to suspect that the attack had been staged, but by whom? One of the most controversial theories suggested that Kaspar had stabbed himself in a desperate bid for attention. Some believed that he had intended to injure himself slightly, hoping for sympathy and renewed public interest in his story, but had accidentally gone too far, delivering a fatal wound. Supporters of this theory pointed out that Kaspar had been accused of lying and exaggerating events in the past, and they believed his death could have been a final act of self-inflicted deception. But if Kaspar had staged the attack, why had he waited hours before seeking help? Why had he continued to insist on his deathbed that he had been stabbed by a stranger? Would he have gone so far as to die to maintain a lie? Others dismissed the idea of a hoax entirely, arguing that his murder was a carefully planned assassination. If Kaspar truly was a missing prince or the key to a powerful secret, then perhaps his enemies had finally caught up with him. He had already survived one attempt on his life in 1829, when an unidentified attacker struck him in the head with a sharp object, leaving a deep wound. Now, in 1833, his second brush with death had been successful. If his murder was an assassination, the motive remained unknown. Was it an attempt to silence him before he remembered something important? Had he been recognized by someone who knew his true origins and saw him as a threat? Or had those who orchestrated his captivity in childhood finally decided to eliminate him for good? After his burial, a small memorial was erected at his grave. The inscription on his tombstone read, "Here lies Kaspar Hauser, enigma of his time. His birth was unknown, his death mysterious, 1833. His death did not put an end to speculation, it only fueled it further." Years later, researchers attempted to solve the case through forensic analysis. DNA tests were conducted on tissue samples believed to have belonged to Kaspar, with the hope of determining his ancestry. Some results suggested a potential connection to the Baden royal family, but no conclusive proof was ever found. To this day, his true origins remain a mystery. The murder of Kaspar Hauser did not bring closure to the mystery surrounding his life. Instead, it only deepened the speculation, fueling centuries of debate, investigations, and conspiracy theories. His sudden and violent death raised more questions than answers, and the case quickly became one of the most perplexing, unsolved mysteries in European history. Kaspar's story was not forgotten after his death. On the contrary, it became even more famous, as writers, historians, and investigators attempted to piece together the truth. His supporters remained convinced that he had been a lost prince, hidden away from the world to prevent him from claiming his rightful place on the throne. Others believed he had been the subject of a cruel experiment designed to study the effects of isolation on a human being. Skeptics, however, continued to insist that he had been nothing more than a fraud, a young man who had fabricated a dramatic story that had ultimately spiraled out of his control. In the years following his death, interest in Kaspar Hauser only grew. Memorials were erected in his honor, including a stone monument in Ansbach, the town where he was killed. The inscription on his grave labeled him as an enigma of his time, a title that would remain fitting even nearly 2 centuries later. In an effort to determine whether Kaspar Hauser had truly been of royal blood, modern scientists have attempted to solve the mystery through DNA testing. Several tests have been conducted over the years, with some results suggesting a possible connection to the Baden royal family, but none have provided conclusive proof. One DNA test, conducted in 2002, compared samples believed to have belonged to Kaspar Hauser with DNA from members of the Baden family. The results showed similarities but were ultimately inconclusive, leaving the question of his true origins frustratingly unresolved. If Kaspar had indeed been the missing Prince of Baden, it would confirm that his life had been deliberately erased from history. But without definitive genetic proof, his true identity remains a mystery. Even today, Kaspar Hauser's story continues to fascinate historians, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts. His case has been the subject of books, films, and scientific studies, each attempting to provide a new perspective on his life and death. Some see him as a symbol of lost innocence, a boy thrown into a world he didn't understand, only to be destroyed by forces beyond his control. Others believe he was a victim of political intrigue, caught in a deadly game of power and secrecy. Yet no matter how many theories emerge, the fact remains that no one knows for sure who Kaspar Hauser really was. More than 200 years after his mysterious appearance in Nuremberg, the story of Kaspar Hauser remains one of history's most enduring enigmas. His name has become synonymous with unsolved mysteries, lost identities, and the dark secrets of the past. The fascination with his case has not faded. Instead, it has grown stronger over time, inspiring countless books, films, scientific studies, and conspiracy theories. But why does Kaspar Hauser's story continue to haunt us? Why, after so many years, are we still captivated by the boy with no past? One of the most unsettling aspects of Kaspar Hauser's story is the simple fact that no one knows where he came from. Unlike most historical mysteries, where at least some details can be traced, Kaspar's past remains a void. He did not exist on any official records, had no known family, and no one ever came forward to claim him. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air. A person with a body, a voice, and emotions, but with no origin. His very existence challenges our understanding of identity. Every human being is shaped by their past, their experiences, their upbringing. But Kaspar was a person without a past, a blank slate whose story began only the moment he appeared in Nuremberg. Kaspar Hauser has come to represent the fear of the unknown, a human figure that does not fit into any logical framework. His extreme isolation, his unusual habits, and his unexplained death have made him an almost mythological figure, standing at the crossroads of history, psychology, and the supernatural. Some researchers have even drawn comparisons between his case and modern theories of abduction and secret experimentation, arguing that he was a manipulated subject, controlled by forces beyond his understanding. His story also reflects the fragility of truth. For every piece of evidence suggesting he was a lost prince, there's another pointing to a hoax. For every claim that he was a victim, there is a counter-argument that he was an imposter. His case forces us to confront the possibility that some mysteries are simply unsolvable, that history can sometimes erase the answers before we even know to look for them. Perhaps the most haunting part of Kaspar's story is his brutal and senseless murder. If he was truly a fraud, why would anyone go to the trouble of killing him? If he was insignificant, why was he stabbed in a dark alley and left to die, just as he had begun to remember pieces of his past? The answer to this question determines everything. If Kaspar was merely a troubled young man who invented a false identity, then his murder remains a tragic coincidence. But if he was truly someone important, someone whose survival threatened powerful individuals, then his death was the final step in a long and carefully orchestrated plan. Even as time passes, Kaspar Hauser's mystery remains as compelling as ever. He has been the subject of countless investigations, with new theories emerging every decade. Yet, despite modern forensic techniques and historical research, we are no closer to the truth than we were in 1833. His story endures because it speaks to something deeper than just a missing identity. It's about power, deception, and the forces that shape history in the shadows. It is about the thin line between truth and illusion, between fact and fabrication. Most of all, it is about the terrifying possibility that some people, no matter how real they seem, can simply disappear, their past wiped clean, their existence reduced to nothing more than an unsolved question. Kaspar Hauser's life remains one of the most unsettling enigmas in history. From the moment he appeared in Nuremberg to the day he was murdered in cold blood, his existence raised more questions than answers. He was a boy without a past, a man who seemed to have no identity, no family, no history. Whether he was the victim of a political conspiracy, a failed psychological experiment, or a master of deception, one thing is certain: someone wanted him dead. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the mystery of Kaspar Hauser refuses to fade. His story has been debated, investigated, and analyzed, yet no definitive truth has ever emerged. Perhaps his case will remain forever unsolved, an enduring symbol of the secrets history has buried, the answers lost in time, and the terrifying reality that sometimes people simply disappear.